Ever imagine living in a city sliced in two, separated not just by walls, but by ideology, by fear? That's exactly what happened in Berlin after World War II, a city at the heart of a global standoff. I'm talking about the Berlin Blockade and Airlift, one of the most tense moments of the early Cold War, where the fate of a city hung in the balance, literally delivered by air. This is History Deciphered with Nathan Gale, and today we're diving into this incredible story. We'll uncover why the Soviets sealed off West Berlin, how the Allies responded with the audacious Berlin Airlift, and the ripple effects this standoff had on the world, shaping the decades that followed. Alright, so picture this. 1945. World War II is finally over, but the world isn't exactly peaceful. Germany, once a mighty power, is in ruins, divided into 4 zones controlled by the victors: the US, the UK, France, and, of course, the Soviet Union. Berlin, smack dab in the middle of the Soviet zone, gets the same treatment, chopped into 4 sectors. It's a recipe for tension, right? You've got these vastly different ideologies rubbing shoulders, mistrust brewing like a bad cup of coffee. It's like a roommate situation gone very, very wrong. This is the backdrop to our story. The US and its allies are all about democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union is pushing its communist agenda. You can see images here of a divided Berlin, the streets scarred by war, the people uncertain about the future, and looming large over everything are the figures of Truman and Stalin, each representing a different vision for the world. The air is thick with suspicion, the fragile peace constantly threatened by this growing rivalry, this Cold War. So, things are already tense in Berlin, this divided city, like a pressure cooker waiting to blow. He was worried, seriously worried, about a unified, economically strong West Germany aligning with the US. It would be like having a rival company set up shop right in your backyard. Not cool, right? His response? Well, let's just say it wasn't subtle. On June 24th, 1948, he slams the door on West Berlin. Roads blocked, railways cut, canals closed. Everything that connected West Berlin to the outside world, to the resources it desperately needed, gone. Just like that. Imagine waking up one morning and finding your city cut off, isolated. No food deliveries, no coal for heating, no medicine coming in. It was a siege, plain and simple. People in West Berlin were stunned. They'd been through so much already. The war, the destruction, and now this. Some were scared, some angry, some just confused. What happens now? They must have thought. Imagine the conversations, the anxieties. One Berliner later recalled looking at the empty streets and thinking, this is it, we're trapped. But, well, let's just say they hadn't met their match yet. Stay tuned to find out what happened next. So, West Berlin is cut off, isolated, facing a bleak future. I mean, how do you supply a city of over 2 million people entirely by air? It sounds crazy, right? Absolutely bonkers. But that's exactly what the Western Allies decided to do. It was a gamble, a huge one, but they weren't about to back down. General Lucius D. Clay, the guy in charge in the US zone, basically said, we're not leaving. We'll feed this city from the sky if we have to. And that's how the Berlin Airlift, or Operation Vittles, as it was cheekily nicknamed, was born. Now, picture this. Hundreds of planes, C-47s and C-54s, these massive cargo planes, taking off and landing around the clock. I'm talking every 3 minutes at the peak of the operation. It was a constant drone in the sky, a symphony of propellers, a testament to pure logistical brilliance. Pilots, many of them veterans of World War II, flew through all kinds of weather, facing immense pressure and the constant threat of Soviet interference. They were true heroes, no doubt. And it wasn't just about the big picture, it was about the little things too. Like Gail Halvorson, the candy bomber. This guy started dropping candy attached to tiny parachutes for the kids of Berlin. Can you imagine? A little bit of sweetness in a sea of uncertainty. It's a story that perfectly captures the human side of this massive operation, the empathy and the connection that went beyond politics and ideology. Seriously, it's the kind of stuff that warms your heart even now. It wasn't easy though. There were accidents, sadly. Planes crashed, lives were lost. The weather could be treacherous, and the Soviets were constantly testing the airlift's limits, buzzing planes, trying to disrupt the operation. But the airlift kept going, a lifeline for West Berlin. Day in, day out, planes landed, cargo was unloaded, food, medicine, coal, everything a city needs to survive. And the people of West Berlin, they weren't just passive recipients. They helped unload the planes, they repaired the runways. They were part of this incredible effort. It was a symbol of hope, a sign that they weren't forgotten. Life in West Berlin during the blockade was, to put it mildly, challenging. Imagine your city is surrounded, cut off from the world. Rationing became a way of life. Food, coal, electricity, everything was strictly controlled. You're bundled up in the winter, not sure where your next meal's coming from, and the constant drone of aircraft overhead becomes the soundtrack to your life. It was stressful, uncertain, and frankly, a bit surreal. But here's the thing about Berliners. They're tough. They'd already been through so much, the war, the destruction, the occupation. They weren't about to give in. This blockade, this attempt to starve them into submission, it actually had the opposite effect. It brought them together. It fostered this incredible sense of community, of shared sacrifice, of resilience. People helped each other out, sharing what little they had. Gardens sprung up in every available space, people growing their own vegetables to supplement the airlifted supplies. There were concerts, plays, and community events. These little pockets of normalcy in the midst of the crisis. It was like, okay, things are tough, but we're going to keep living. We're not going to let this break us. And the airlift, that constant stream of planes overhead, it wasn't just about supplies. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that they weren't alone. It was a powerful psychological boost, both for the Berliners and for the Western Allies. For the Soviets, though, it was a different story. The airlift, their inability to break the city's spirit, it was a major propaganda blow. They'd underestimated the West's resolve, and the world was watching. The images of those planes landing every few minutes, those determined pilots, those resilient Berliners, those images spoke volumes. They told a story of defiance, of unity, of a city that refused to be broken. So, after nearly a year of this incredible airlift, this constant back and forth, the blockade, it finally breaks. May 12th, 1949, a date to remember. But why did Stalin give in? I mean, this was a major operation, a huge undertaking for the Soviets, and they just stopped. Well, like a lot of history, it's complicated, but a few things played a big role. First, the airlift itself. It wasn't just working, it was thriving. Those planes, they weren't just delivering the bare minimum, they were exceeding expectations. Think about it. They were bringing in more supplies by air than had previously come in by land and water combined. That's insane. The Soviets realized they weren't going to starve West Berlin into submission. In fact, they were making the West look like heroes. Second, there were negotiations happening behind the scenes. Lots of back and forth, lots of tense discussions. It wasn't easy, but eventually, the Soviets agreed to lift the blockade. And this was a massive propaganda win for the West. They'd stood up to Soviet pressure. They'd shown the world their commitment to West Berlin, and they'd done it without firing a shot. Seriously, think about the optics of that. And finally, let's not forget the cost. The blockade was expensive for the Soviets, both financially and politically. It was hurting their image on the world stage, and it was making the West look stronger and more unified. Stalin, being the pragmatist that he was, probably realized that continuing the blockade just wasn't worth it. So, on May 12th, 1949, the barricades came down, the trains started running, and the trucks began to roll. The blockade was over, but its impact, its legacy, that was just beginning. Imagine that moment, the relief, the joy, the sense of victory. It's a powerful image, and one that really captures the significance of this pivotal Cold War moment. Okay, so the blockade is over, right? Everyone breathes a sigh of relief. But the story, it doesn't end there, not even close. The Berlin Blockade, as dramatic as it was, really just set the stage for, well, for a whole lot more drama. It was like the first act in a much longer play, a play with some pretty high stakes. One of the biggest consequences, the most obvious one, was the formal division of Germany. I mean, it was already divided in practice, but after the blockade, it became official. Two separate countries, West Germany, aligned with the West, and East Germany, firmly under Soviet control. This division, it wasn't just lines on a map, it was a dividing line through families, through communities, through the heart of Europe itself, and it would last for decades. And then there's NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, just months after the blockade ended. It's more like this big alliance, this promise that an attack on one is an attack on all. The blockade, it showed the Western powers that they needed to stick together, that they needed a strong military alliance to counter Soviet influence. So, NATO, it's a direct result of this standoff in Berlin. But the consequences went even further. The Berlin Blockade, it really ramped up the Cold War. It increased tensions, deepened mistrust, and basically kicked off an arms race. Both sides started stockpiling weapons, building up their militaries, preparing for, well, for the worst. And finally, let's talk about the Berlin Wall. Built in 1961, it became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, this concrete barrier separating East and West Berlin. While the wall itself came later, its roots, its origins, they lie in the Berlin Blockade. The blockade showed just how far the Soviets were willing to go, and it set in motion the events that would ultimately lead to the wall's construction. So, the legacy of the Berlin Blockade, it's huge. It shaped the course of the Cold War, it divided a nation, and it led to the creation of one of history's most powerful military alliances. It's a story of courage, resilience, and, well, a whole lot of tension. A story that reminds us just how fragile peace can be and how quickly things can escalate when ideologies clash. So, let's take a step back and think about what we've just uncovered. The Berlin Blockade. It wasn't just about planes and supplies. It was a high-stakes poker game between superpowers, a test of wills, a turning point. It showed the world just how far each side was willing to go, and it set the stage for the next 4 decades of Cold War tension. Really, it's hard to overstate its significance. This wasn't just a local event. It had global ripples. It solidified the division of Germany, gave birth to NATO, and fueled the arms race. It's a story of resilience, of a city that refused to be bullied, and of ordinary people caught in the crosshairs of history. Seriously, the courage of the Berliners, it's inspiring. Now I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think was the most surprising thing about the Berlin Blockade? Do you see any parallels to what's happening in the world today? Let's discuss it in the comments below. And hey, while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to History Deciphered for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. Thanks for joining me, Nathan Gale, for this exploration of the Berlin Blockade, a time when the world truly held its